Usually, when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's a certain expectation of, you know, precision.
Right, like it's a known quantity.
Exactly. Like you break a bone, the
Mm.
x-ray shows this jagged white line across your arm, and the doctor just points to the screen.
Yeah, the fracture is right there. It's visible.
It's right there. And the treatment plan is standard, a cast, maybe a pin. It's very straightforward.
Because it's a closed system, really. I mean, the variables are largely known, and the physical mechanics of a bone healing are universal.
But, step into the realm of macroeconomics, specifically a developing economy that's undergoing these profound structural and political transitions, and that whole diagnostic machine just completely shorts out.
Oh, it absolutely does.
You are no longer looking at a clean x-ray. You're looking at the system where the symptoms actually contradict each other.
Yeah, where the medicine for one problem, like, severely aggravates another one.
Right. And where the data itself can sometimes be a bit of a mirage.
That is honestly the perfect way to frame what we are looking at today, because we are examining an economic landscape defined by overlapping crises.
Yeah.
Isolating a single cause is nearly impossible because every single variable is tethered to, like, a dozen others.
So we have a massive stack of study materials on the table today, and this is sourced from the live written curriculum.
Right, and these documents, they aren't meant for casual reading.
Oh, not at all.
They're designed specifically for banking professionals in Bangladesh.
The actual people who have to sit at the desks,
Yeah.
right? The ones approving the loans, managing the foreign exchange, and basically navigating this incredibly complex terrain every single day.
Which makes this data set just incredibly valuable for us. We aren't looking at theoretical models drafted in some university lounge somewhere.
No, we are looking at the operational reality of a country with over 170 million people.
Yeah, a global manufacturing powerhouse that's currently standing at a very severe economic and geopolitical crossroads.
And I have to say, the data paints a picture that is incredibly tense.
Very tested.
But our mission today, for you listening, is to dig into the actual mechanics of this economy. We want to move past the dense acronyms and the raw statistics to really understand the friction happening on the ground.
Right, because there's a lot of ground to cover.
There is. We're going from the reality of global inflation and the International Monetary Fund all the way down to domestic banking crises and the actual mechanics of microfinance. And even if you don't have an economics degree, you're going to walk away from this deep dive completely understanding all of it.
I love that. And we really do have to start at the foundation, because before anyone cares about the bond market or sovereign credit ratings, they care about, what it costs to live.
Exactly. Okay, let's unpack this. We have to start with the daily friction of purchasing power, because the curriculum data points to a deeply entrenched inflation crisis in Bangladesh right now.
Yeah, deeply entrenched is the right phrase.
And we hear the word inflation thrown around so casually on the news, right? It's usually just framed as, like, prices are going up.
Which is such a surface level way to look at it.
Right. But looking at the data here, it's more accurate to describe it as a fundamental weakening of the currency itself. Like your money is losing its superpower.
That is a crucial distinction to make. The physical rice or the liter of cooking oil, it hasn't intrinsically changed.
Right. It's still the same rice.
Exactly. What has changed is the energy required by the currency to acquire it. The sources explicitly refer to this as purchasing power erosion.
Erosion, yeah, that's a visceral word.
It is. If you hold a 100 taka note today, its ability to command goods and services in the physical world is just bleeding out day by day compared to yesterday.
And the data on this erosion is stark, like really stark. Inflation in Bangladesh hasn't just been a brief little spike. The data shows it has hovered around 10% for over 2 years.
Wow.
Yeah, 2 years. And it peaked at a staggering 11.66% in July 2024.
That's a massive peak.
It is. Now, the projections in the curriculum suggest it might dip to 8.71% by March 2026. But let's be super clear about what that actually means.
Right, because people hear a drop from 11 to 8 and think, oh, great, things are getting cheaper.
Exactly. But they aren't.
Not at all. It just means the rate at which you are becoming poorer has slightly decelerated. The prices are still climbing. That 8% erosion is compounding right on top of the previous year's 11% erosion.
And I really want to look at who actually absorbs this impact, because the curriculum notes that this specifically devastates salaried individuals, informal workers, and small businesses.
Yeah, the people who can least afford it.
Right. And it makes sense mechanically. If you are a day laborer, your wages are what economists call sticky. They don't just magically adjust upward every single morning to match the new price of lentils at the market.
wage stickiness is the absolute trap here. If
Mm.
your income is completely fixed and the cost of your just your baseline caloric intake and transportation rises by over 11% in a single year,
Yeah.
well, that 11% has to be subtracted from somewhere else.
You literally have to make cuts.
You do. The text specifically notes that households are cutting back on essentials. And we aren't talking about, deciding to skip a summer vacation.
No. The data says they are delaying necessary medical treatments.
Right. They're pulling their children out of supplemental tutoring, or they are literally reducing the amount of protein in their daily diet.
It's a systematic degradation of the standard of living, and it's happening while the broader economic engine of the country is sputtering.
Yeah, the growth numbers reflect that.
They do. The data shows economic growth decelerated sharply to just 3.7% in FY25. So you have skyrocketing prices and a slowing economy simultaneously.
Which is a classic, very painful stagflation scenario.
But, I want to challenge the narrative just a little bit here. We see these numbers, the 11.66% inflation, the slowing growth, and I feel like the immediate reaction is always to blame the domestic policymakers.
Sure, people assume someone at the central bank just pressed the wrong button on a spreadsheet.
Right. But how much of this is actually local mismanagement, and how much is just the harsh reality of being a developing nation caught in a turbulent global supply chain?
It's really a collision of both, and separating them requires looking closely at the mechanics of global trade. Let's trace the global supply chain friction first, because the sources point heavily to the domino effect of geopolitical conflicts.
Especially in the Middle East.
Exactly. When there are disruptions in the Red Sea, it fundamentally alters global shipping routes.
Because the cargo ships have to physically reroute around the entire continent of Africa just to avoid the conflict zones.
Right. And that's not a minor detour. That adds weeks to the journey, which means it requires substantially more bunker fuel to keep the ships moving.
Plus, the maritime insurance premiums probably spike, right?
They trigger massive spikes in insurance. All of that added friction translates directly into higher freight costs.
So by the time that container of essential commodities, or even just raw manufacturing materials, arrives at the port of Chittagong.
The baseline cost has already surged before it even clears customs.
Okay, the physical logistics of the shipping lanes totally make sense. But the curriculum also spends a lot of time discussing the United States Federal Reserve and this strong dollar phenomenon.
Yes, this is a massive piece of the puzzle.
And I think this trips a lot of people up, including myself sometimes. If the central bank in Washington, D.C. decides to raise interest rates, just to cool down the American housing market or whatever, why does a family in Dhaka suddenly find it harder to afford imported cooking oil?
It really comes down to the plumbing of the global financial system. You have to remember that the vast majority of international trade is settled in U.S. dollars.
Regardless of who is trading with who.
Exactly. Whether Bangladesh is purchasing petroleum from the Middle East, or heavy machinery from Germany, or raw cotton for its garment sector from India, those contracts are priced and paid in U.S. dollars.
The dollar is basically the universal linguistic currency of trade.
Right. Now, when the U.S. Federal Reserve aggressively raises interest rates, it alters the risk-to-reward ratio for global capital.
Because suddenly, investors can get a really attractive return just by putting their money in the U.S.
Exactly. They get a virtually risk-free return simply by holding U.S. Treasury bonds.
So capital acts like water flowing through the steepest drop. It just pulls right out of emerging markets.
It floods out of developing economies and rushes toward the United States. And this massive global demand for the dollar, because everyone needs dollars to buy those U.S. assets, makes the dollar incredibly strong relative to other currencies.
Oh, I see.
Consequently, the Bangladeshi taka depreciates against it.
So even if the global price of a barrel of crude oil stays exactly the same, let's say it stays at $80 a barrel,
Right.
Bangladesh still has to print or utilize significantly more taka to buy those same $80.
Precisely. That is the definition of imported inflation. The cost of fuel spikes domestically.
Which means the trucks transporting the rice from the rural farms to the markets in Dhaka have to charge more for freight.
Which means the vendor in the market has to raise the price of the rice to cover the freight.
It's a brutal transmission mechanism. It just cascades down to the consumer. And the text shows the immense toll this took on the country's macroeconomic buffer.
You're talking about the foreign exchange reserves.
Yeah, the actual stockpile of foreign currency the central bank holds to pay for these imports. The data says it plummeted. It dropped from $48.1 billion in 2021 all the way down to $31.77 billion in FY 24-25.
That is a terrifying burn rate for a central bank. You are rapidly depleting the very asset you need to survive in the international market, just trying to keep the lights on and the factories running.
But, the curriculum is careful not to let local policy completely off the hook here.
Oh, absolutely not.
It's not entirely a victim of global circumstance narrative. There is a quote in the material from Dr. Zahid Hussain, the former lead economist at the World Bank Dhaka office, and it's particularly sharp.
What did he say?
He notes, and I'm quoting here, "Inflation in Bangladesh is not just a temporary shock. It's a structural challenge that calls for deeper reforms in governance, trade, and data reliability."
Yeah, that phrase structural challenge is the key takeaway there. The global shocks, the shipping lanes, the U.S. interest rates, they basically acted as massive stress tests.
They applied immense pressure.
Right. But the structure itself had pre-existing fractures that amplified the damage.
So what kind of local fractures are we talking about?
Well, the sources highlight severe inefficiencies in domestic supply chains. For example, there is a persistent issue with market syndicates.
Like local cartels?
Essentially, yes, localized cartels or middlemen networks that artificially restrict the supply of essential goods to keep prices elevated. It's completely detached from actual production costs.
Wow.
And furthermore, for a long time, the central bank maintained a very rigid, artificially controlled exchange rate.
Meaning they were trying to manually hold the Taka's value higher than the open market actually dictated.
Yes. And when you try to fight the global market by manually fixing your currency, you bleed your foreign reserves even faster because you're constantly spending your own dollars to prop up the illusion.
And when the pressure finally becomes too much and you are forced to let the currency depreciate.
The shock to the consumer is sudden and violent, rather than a gradual, manageable adjustment.
So the foundation was already compromised before the global storm even hit.
Exactly.
And watching those reserves drop from 48 billion to 31 billion, that triggers a massive alarm. If a country runs out of foreign exchange reserves, it literally cannot buy fuel or medicines or raw materials. The whole machine just grinds to a halt.
Which perfectly explains the immediate pivot in the curriculum to the intervention of the International Monetary Fund.
The IMF. The lender of last resort.
Exactly. When a nation's balance of payments is severely upside down and commercial borrowing from regular banks is too expensive or just entirely unavailable, the IMF steps in to prevent a total sovereign default.
The documentation here outlines the exact mechanics of this lifeline. It details the IMF approving an immediate disbursement of SDR 352.35 million.
Right.
Now, SDR is a term that definitely needs unpacking. Special drawing rights.
It does sound a bit opaque.
It sounds like an accounting gimmick, honestly.
Yeah.
Like, what exactly is an SDR, and how does it buy a cargo ship full of petroleum?
Well, it is essentially an accounting unit, but it's a very powerful one. An SDR is an international reserve asset created by the IMF. It is not a physical currency you can hold in your hand.
Okay, so what gives it value?
Its value is based on a basket of the world's major currencies: the US dollar, the euro, the Chinese renminbi, the Japanese yen, and the British pound.
Oh, I see. So it's sort of an international VIP currency that smooths out the volatility of any single currency.
Correct. So when the IMF allocates these SDRs to Bangladesh, Bangladesh can then exchange those SDRs with other IMF member countries for freely usable currencies.
They literally trade the SDRs for actual US dollars or euros.
Exactly, which they can then use to bolster their reserves or actually pay for physical imports.
That makes a lot of sense. So the curriculum states that the initial SDR disbursement was equivalent to roughly 476 million US dollars.
Right.
And as of December 2025, the data says Bangladesh has received a total of $3.64 billion across 5 tranches. Now wait, why tranches? If a country is bleeding out and needs help, why not just wire the full $3.64 billion all at once?
Because of conditionality and moral hazard.
Moral hazard.
Yeah. The IMF's core philosophy is that a balance of payments crisis is usually a symptom of deep systemic fiscal mismanagement.
The structural fractures we were just talking about.
Right. And the term the text highlights here is the fiscal deficit.
Which is just the gap between what a government spends and what it actually collects in revenue through taxes. Right?
Exactly. Now imagine if the IMF simply handed over the entire $3.64 billion up front.
The government could just use that money to plug the deficit and keep the party going.
Precisely. They could keep spending unsustainably, completely avoid making any difficult political choices, and end up in the exact same crisis 3 years later, just with significantly more debt.
So the tranches act as leverage. It's like a strict personal trainer. They'll give you the water you desperately need, but they're going to make you do 100 painful burpees to get the next sip.
That is a very accurate analogy. You get the next installment only if you prove to the IMF that you are actively fixing the underlying plumbing.
And the conditions are strict. The curriculum details them extensively. First, the IMF demanded a transition to a market-based exchange rate.
Right. The central bank had to stop burning reserves to artificially prop up the taka. They had to let it float and find its true market value.
Which, as we discussed, causes immediate inflationary pain locally as imports become more expensive.
Yeah.
But at least it stops the bleeding of the national reserves.
Exactly. It's painful, but necessary medicine. And the second major condition is enhancing fiscal transparency and revenue mobilization.
Meaning collecting more taxes.
Yes. And this is a massive hurdle for Bangladesh, because historically the country has had one of the lowest tax to GDP ratios in the entire world, hovering around just 7 to 8%.
Wait. Let's pause on that. A 7% tax to GDP ratio.
Yes.
For context, many developed nations are in the 30% to 40% range. Why on earth is it so low in Bangladesh? Is it just a massive informal economy that exists totally off the books?
It's a combination of factors. Yes, a vast informal sector is a big part of it, but there are also massive tax exemptions given to specific industries, particularly the garment sector.
Protecting the golden goose.
Right. Add to that severe administrative inefficiencies and, frankly, widespread tax evasion among the wealthier tiers of society.
So the IMF is looking at this and saying, you can't pay your bills because you aren't collecting any money.
Exactly. The IMF's conditionality basically demands that the government broaden the tax net and actually collect the revenue it is legally owed, because you simply cannot run a modern state, build mega infrastructure, and service global debt on a 7% revenue base.
It's mathematically impossible.
It really is.
And the text also notes an interesting, very modern addition to these IMF conditions. A strong focus on climate adaptation and green growth initiatives.
Yes, this is a newer evolution in IMF policy.
It's not just about balancing the ledger with a calculator anymore. It's about acknowledging that for a country like Bangladesh, environmental vulnerability is an existential economic threat.
Entirely. A single cyclone or severe coastal flooding event can wipe out billions of dollars in infrastructure and agricultural output overnight. So the IMF is actively forcing the incorporation of climate risks into the country's macroeconomic planning.
But, implementing these reforms, letting the currency depreciate, aggressively raising taxes, removing subsidies on electricity and fuel to balance the budget, these are aggressive austerity measures.
Highly aggressive.
And the text neutrally outlines the socioeconomic dilemma here. Austerity hits the exact same people we just talked about in the inflation segment, the middle and lower classes.
It absolutely does. When the government removes a subsidy on natural gas to satisfy an IMF budget target, the cost of manufacturing goes up, the cost of generating electricity goes up, and the everyday consumer's utility bill just skyrockets.
It's deeply unpopular.
And politically volatile.
So I have to ask the cynical question here. If this medicine causes so much immediate, localized pain to the voting public, why does the government actually swallow it? Is it purely because they physically need that specific $3.64 billion to avoid defaulting?
The money is vital, of course, but the text points to something arguably much more important in the long run. The catalyst effect.
The catalyst effect.
Yes. The IMF is often viewed as the ultimate global auditor.
Okay.
When the IMF signs off on a loan program and actually begins dispersing those tranches, it signals to the rest of the world that this country is serious.
It signals the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank.
And most importantly, private foreign investors. It tells them that Bangladesh has officially submitted to strict macroeconomic discipline.
It's the ultimate stamp of approval. It's like telling global capital, hey, it's safe to come back on the water, the adults are supervising the pool.
Theoretically, yes. It is supposed to restore investor sentiment and unlock other pools of global capital that were frozen by the initial crisis.
Theoretically.
Yes, theoretically.
Because when we turn to the next massive data set in the curriculum, we see a glaring, almost scary contradiction.
We do.
The IMF is in the house. The painful reforms are actively being implemented. The catalyst effect is supposedly working its magic. But the data on foreign investment shows something entirely different.
Private capital isn't flowing in.
No, it is actively fleeing.
And this is where the macro stabilization narrative from the IMF really crashes into the micro operational reality on the ground. We really need to look closely at the data on foreign direct investment, or FDI.
Let's define the mechanics of FDI for a moment, because I want to be clear that it's very distinct from just, buying stocks or bonds.
Oh, very distinct. Foreign direct investment is not highly liquid portfolio investment.
Right, it's not a hedge fund in London buying sovereign bonds that they can just sell tomorrow with a keystroke.
Exactly. FDI is hard physical commitment. It is a foreign multinational company bringing actual capital across the border to build a tangible factory, to import heavy machinery, to hire thousands of local workers, and to integrate into the domestic economy for the long haul.
It is the absolute bedrock of industrialization and technology transfer.
Yes.
And the curriculum breaks FDI down into two crucial components: equity capital and reinvested earnings.
Right, and understanding both is key. Equity capital is the influx of entirely new money. It's a brand new investor deciding to build a facility from scratch.
Fresh cash entering the country.
Exactly. Reinvested earnings, however, is a fascinating metric of internal confidence. It represents the profits made by foreign companies that are already operating inside Bangladesh.
So they make a profit in local taka, and instead of converting it back to dollars and sending it to their headquarters in Tokyo or New York,
They decide the absolute best use of that capital is to expand their operations inside Bangladesh.
so reinvested earnings are essentially the ultimate vote of confidence from the people who already know the operational reality of the country intimately.
That's exactly what it is.
So let's look at the numbers. What does the curriculum actually reveal about this confidence right now?
The data drops the hammer. It is alarming. Net FDI plummeted to $1.27 billion in 2024.
Wow.
That represents a 13.25% drop from the previous year, making it the lowest level of FDI inflow the country has seen in 5 years.
A 5-year low.
Right.
Right at the exact moment the country desperately needs foreign capital to offset the domestic squeeze we talked about.
Yes.
And if we look at the quarterly breakdown provided in the text, it gets even steeper. The July to September quarter of FY 2024-25 saw net FDI basically flatline at just $104.33 million.
And returning to that crucial metric of internal confidence, reinvested earnings, the data shows a brutal 19.24% contraction.
Almost 20%.
Yeah. The companies that are already there, the ones on the ground, are actively choosing to pull their profits out rather than reinvest them in the country.
This is the massive paradox. The IMF is saying the macro framework is being repaired, but the foreign executives on the factory floor are packing their bags. Why?
The curriculum outlines several political and structural realities that explain this, and we have to address the most significant one impartially, as it is a massive data point in the text.
The political transition.
Yes, the text explicitly notes the July 2024 revolution as a major inflection point,
It records the resignation of Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina.
and the subsequent transition to an interim government led by Nobel laureate Dr. Muhammad Yunus.
So from a purely economic capital flow perspective, how does a multinational corporation react to a systemic political upheaval of that magnitude?
Capital is inherently risk-averse, above all else. When you have widespread protests, civil unrest, and a complete change in the governing apparatus, investors immediately adopt a wait-and-see posture.
Because the rules of the game are suddenly completely blank.
Exactly. If you are a multinational planning a $50 million expansion of an electronics assembly plant, you freeze that project.
You just put it on ice.
You have to. You don't know what the new interim government's policies will be regarding corporate taxation or labor rights or export subsidies. You wait for the dust to settle, for the political environment to stabilize, and for a clear regulatory framework to emerge.
But surely it's not just the political transition driving this 5-year low. I mean, a revolution might cause a quarterly dip, but this looks like a sustained structural erosion of confidence.
You're right, the political uncertainty is just the accelerant poured on existing structural fires.
Like the inflation.
Yes, the high inflation and the volatile exchange rate we discussed earlier are massive deterrents. Think about it. If a foreign company brings in millions of dollars, converts it to taka to build a factory, and then the taka rapidly depreciates over the next year.
The actual value of their investment in dollar terms is actively shrinking, even if the factory is successful.
Exactly. And the text also points out restrictions on dollar repatriation.
Because the central bank's foreign exchange reserves were so dangerously low, they put up guardrails to stop dollars from leaving.
Which is a completely rational move for a central bank desperately trying to protect its reserves. But it is a catastrophic signal for foreign investors.
Right, because if a foreign entity makes a legitimate profit in Bangladesh, But the central bank makes it bureaucratically impossible to convert those takas back into dollars to send home.
The entire investment thesis collapses. If you cannot extract your returns, you will not deploy the capital in the first place.
It's basically a roach motel for capital. It checks in, but it can't check out.
That's a grim way to put it, but yes. And finally, the curriculum highlights a very specific vulnerability driving this FDI drop: labor unrest in the ready-made garment sector, the RMG sector.
The absolute titan of the Bangladeshi export economy.
Right. But the data notes frequent labor agitations, wage protests, and factory shutdowns due to strikes.
Now, I want to push back on this a little, or at least view it from the foreign investor's perspective. Bangladesh has historically attracted FDI specifically because of its incredibly competitive labor costs. If the labor force is demanding higher wages, doesn't that inherently reduce the attractiveness for foreign capital looking for the cheapest needle and thread?
It alters the equation, certainly. But you have to realize it's not just the absolute cost of the wage that spooks investors. It's the operational reliability.
Reliability.
Yes. Global supply chains operate on highly tuned, just-in-time delivery schedules. A fast fashion brand in Europe expects a massive shipment of winter coats to be loaded on a vessel by a very specific date.
Because if they miss the winter season, the coats are worthless.
Exactly. If a factory faces continuous wildcat strikes or unpredictable shutdowns due to unrest, the supply chain breaks. The foreign buyer doesn't just lose money on the wage increase, they lose entire seasonal sales cycles. The unpredictability is honestly more damaging to FDI than the wage increase itself.
So if we pull back and look at the board, we have a scenario where global inflation is crushing consumer demand, the IMF is enforcing necessary but very painful fiscal austerity, and the foreign direct investment that usually fuels economic growth is actively retreating to the sidelines.
It's a perfect storm.
So logically, in a closed system, if the foreign capital dries up, the domestic capital markets have to step in. The local banks have to be the engine of growth.
That is the textbook macroeconomic response. Domestic credit expansion should fill the void left by fleeing FDI.
But the curriculum reveals that the domestic banking sector is completely incapable of filling that void.
Not only incapable, but actively dangerous.
Right. In fact, it is harboring a massive toxic secret that threatens to pull the entire economy under. And this brings us to the data on NPLs.
This is arguably the most critical and systemic threat detailed in the entire study material. If the macroeconomy is the engine, the banking sector is the oil. And the NPL crisis represents a catastrophic contamination of that oil.
Let's define the mechanics of an NPL for anyone unfamiliar. Non-performing loan.
Right.
In the simplest terms, if a business borrows, say, $1 billion taka to build a factory, and they fail to make a scheduled interest or principal payment for a specific period, usually 90 days, that loan is officially classified as non-performing. It's bad debt.
And when that happens, the bank has to assume that money might be gone forever, and they have to set aside their own capital to cover the potential loss.
That process of setting aside capital is called provisioning, right?
Exactly. And in a functional, healthy banking environment, NPLs are just a standard cost of doing business. Markets fluctuate, companies go bankrupt, loans go bad. A well-managed bank anticipates a low single-digit percentage of NPLs and provisions for them without threatening its own solvency.
But the data in this curriculum isn't describing a normal single-digit rate of business failure.
No.
It is describing an industrial-scale failure.
It describes a systemic, culturally entrenched failure, facilitated by a deeply deceptive accounting practice known as evergreening.
I really want to spend some time on the mechanics of evergreening, because the term itself sounds almost sustainable and pleasant.
It sounds eco-friendly.
Yeah, but it is anything but. How does a bank actually evergreen a loan?
Okay, imagine a large corporate borrower owes a bank a massive payment, and they simply do not have the cash flow to pay it. The loan is about to become an NPL.
Which would require the bank to take a huge hit to its profits and admit the loss to the regulators.
Right, nobody wants that. So instead of classifying it as a bad debt, the bank essentially issues a brand new loan to the same defaulting borrower.
Wait, they give them more money?
Yes, but the borrower takes the funds from the new loan and immediately hands it back to the bank to pay off the old loan.
So no actual economic activity has taken place at all?
None.
No new factories was built, no new workers were hired. It's just a circular flow of numbers on a spreadsheet to satisfy an auditor.
Exactly.
But
On paper, the original loan looks like it was successfully serviced. The borrower is suddenly deemed current again. But the underlying reality is that the borrower's debt burden has just grown larger, and the bank's exposure to this failing entity has deepened.
they are just compounding the rot.
They are.
It's the exact equivalent of a consumer opening a brand new credit card with a higher limit just to pay the minimum balance on their old maxed out credit card.
That is exactly what it is.
You haven't solved the debt problem. You've just delayed the explosion and guaranteed the blast radius will be way larger when it finally happens.
And the metric we use to measure a bank's ability to survive that eventual explosion is the CRR.
The capital to risk-weighted assets ratio. Let's translate that out of Basel III regulatory jargon for a second.
Think of CRR as the structural integrity of the bank, the shock absorber. It measures a bank's core capital, its own money, essentially against the riskiness of all the loans it has given out.
So if a high percentage of loans start defaulting, the bank's core capital absorbs the losses.
Right. If the CRR is high, the bank has a thick shock absorber. It can take heavy losses without going bankrupt, and crucially, without threatening the deposits of everyday citizens.
But if the CRR is low, the shock absorber is paper thin. A slight bump in the road and the axle completely breaks.
Yeah, exactly.
So looking at the live written data, what is the scale of the NPL crisis and how thin is this shock absorber?
The raw numbers are staggering. By the end of September 2025, total officially recognized NPLs in the banking sector reached 6.44 trillion taka. Trillion. And what is most alarming is the acceleration. This figure surged by roughly 2 trillion taka in just a single 12-month period.
2 trillion taka of newly classified bad debt in 1 year. That heavily implies that a massive wave of those evergreen loans finally hit a wall and could no longer be hidden by spreadsheet magic.
Yes, the music stopped, and a white paper cited within the curriculum suggests the reality is actually far worse than that official 6.44 trillion figure.
How could it be worse?
Because when they account for true distressed assets, which includes loans frozen in endless litigation, loans currently undergoing aggressive rescheduling, and the officially recognized NPLs, the total estimate leaps to 6.75 lakh crore taka.
6.75 lakh crore.
Yeah.
I mean, we are losing scale here because the numbers are just so astronomically large.
I know. It translates to nearly 31.7% of all total loans in the entire banking sector.
Wait, really?
Yes. Nearly 1 out of every 3 taka lent out by the banks is distressed, non-performing, or tied up in court.
That is the aha moment right there.
Yeah.
The curriculum provides a really brilliant contextual comparison to make that visceral, because lakh crore just sounds like noise to most people.
It does.
It notes that this mountain of distressed debt is equivalent to the entire cost of building 14 Dhaka Metro rail networks,
14 of them.
or 22.5 Padma bridges.
It is decades of transformational generational infrastructure capital entirely vaporized on bad ledgers.
And because of this massive hole in the balance sheets, the CRAR, that shock absorber we talked about, has degraded severely. The data shows the aggregate CRR of the banking sector dropping from an already vulnerable 6.86% in September 2024 down to a deeply critical 3.08% by December 2024.
The cushion is effectively gone. The banking system is operating on the edge of a razor.
Now, we have to ask the obvious question. How does a banking system accidentally accumulate 14 Dhaka Metros worth of bad debt?
It doesn't happen accidentally.
Right. Who is borrowing this money and failing to pay it back? Is it like millions of small businesses failing simultaneously because of the inflation?
No, not at all. The data provides a very clear attribution. The crisis is heavily concentrated. The text explicitly points to the state-owned commercial banks.
The government-run institutions?
Yes. These specific institutions account for nearly 50% of all the NPLs in the country, despite the fact that they only disperse about 25% of the total loans.
Oh, wow. They are managing a quarter of the portfolio but generating half of the toxicity.
Yes.
That strongly implies a fundamental flaw in how they actually originate these loans.
The sources are quite blunt about the mechanics of this failure. It is driven by poor corporate governance, intense political interference, and an entrenched culture of impunity among very powerful borrowers.
So unlike a private commercial bank that theoretically assesses a loan based purely on cash flow projections and hard collateral,
These state-owned banks frequently originated massive loans based on the political connections of the borrower. The standard credit risk analysis was simply bypassed.
just to prove the loan, he knows the right people.
Exactly. And when these politically connected industrial conglomerates inevitably failed to service the debt, the bank executives lacked the autonomy or the political cover to seize the collateral or force bankruptcy.
They couldn't foreclose on them.
No. Instead, they were heavily pressured to evergreen the loans, keep the illusion alive.
There is a quote here from Sheikh Faisal Fahim, a former trade leader, who states, "We cannot build an inclusive and resilient economy while default culture and weak recovery mechanisms continue unchecked."
It's a culture.
Yeah, it implies it's not a failure of business strategy, it's a structural failure of accountability. But I want to bring this back to the macroeconomy for our listeners. Because if these ultra-rich, politically connected borrowers are defaulting on trillions of taka, how does that actually impact the average citizen or the honest business owner? Why should they care about a state-owned bank's balance sheet?
They should care because it impacts them directly through a mechanism called the crowding out effect.
Okay, let's unpack that.
Banks have a finite pool of capital to lend. If nearly 32% of that capital is trapped in distressed assets, the pool of available, healthy money shrinks dramatically.
Right.
And because money is now scarce, the price of borrowing it, the interest rate shoots up.
So the honest, mid-sized manufacturer who just wants a legitimate loan to buy new weaving machines is suddenly faced with exorbitant double-digit interest rates.
Exactly. The honest borrower is forced to pay a massive premium to indirectly subsidize the losses incurred by the defaulting elites. The productive sectors of the economy are literally starved of affordable capital, which directly stunts economic growth and job creation.
And there is a secondary, honestly more insidious impact, right? If a massive state-owned bank reaches the brink of absolute insolvency because its CRAR has dropped to 3%, it cannot be allowed to fail.
Absolutely not. A failure would trigger a panic and a run on deposits that could collapse the entire financial system.
So the government has to step in.
They have to recapitalize the bank. They have to inject fresh cash to plug the hole.
And where does the government get that cash?
From the taxpayers.
Wow.
It diverts public funds away from healthcare, education, and infrastructure to bail out the balance sheets of banks ruined by crony lending. The public essentially pays for the default twice. First in inflation and high interest rates, and then in taxes to fund the bailout.
That is grim. We have spent a significant amount of time in the dark machinery of this economy. The global inflation squeezing the poor, the austerity demanded by the IMF, the capital flight of foreign investors, and a domestic banking system structurally paralyzed by trillions of taka in toxic debt.
It's a heavy picture.
If the analysis stopped right here, it would be a portrait of an unrecoverable collapse.
It would. But the curriculum introduces a massive paradigm shift in the latter half.
It does. It reveals an entirely parallel economic engine operating within the exact same country, under the exact same macroeconomic constraints, but yielding spectacularly different results.
We are looking at the grassroots level. The alternative economic models that Bangladesh didn't just adopt, but historically pioneered for the entire world.
Yes. The curriculum highlights the mechanics of microfinance.
And this is the absolute antithesis of the state-owned commercial banking model we just discussed.
Completely opposite. Let's break down why. Traditional commercial banking is predicated on the concept of hard collateral. You want a loan. Show us the deed to your land, the title to your heavy machinery, or a pristine historical credit score.
Which systematically excludes the vast majority of the population in a developing nation.
Right. A rural woman trying to start a small poultry business or buy a sewing machine does not have a land deed. To a traditional risk assessor in a high-rise bank, she is invisible or entirely unbankable.
Microfinance flips that premise entirely on its head. It is the practice of extending very small loans to the absolute poorest demographics, almost entirely without physical collateral.
Without collateral. How does the risk model even function? If they don't pay it back, the bank has literally nothing to repossess.
It functions because it replaces physical collateral with social collateral. The architecture of microfinance, which was pioneered heavily by organizations like Grameen Bank, often relies on the joint liability group model.
How does that work?
Loans are given to individuals, but those individuals are organized into small peer groups within their village.
So the community itself acts as the underwriter.
Exactly. If one member of the group defaults, the entire group loses access to future credit. And because these are incredibly tight-knit rural communities, the social pressure to repay the loan is immense. The risk of ostracization and losing the only available lifeline of capital ensures rigorous financial discipline.
And the data the curriculum provides to validate this model is simply astonishing, especially when you place it right next to the NPL data of the corporate elites we just talked about.
The contrast is mind-blowing.
What is the repayment rate for these collateral-free loans given to the poorest citizens?
Grameen Bank reports a staggering 99% repayment rate.
99%.
It's incredible.
It is a stunning juxtaposition. The massive industrial conglomerates armed with legal teams, political connections, and vast physical assets are defaulting at a rate that threatens to implode the national economy, generating 31.7% distressed assets. Meanwhile, the rural micro-entrepreneurs, borrowing a few $100s based on nothing but mutual trust and community standing, are servicing their debt flawlessly.
It completely dismantles the traditional banking assumption that the poor are inherently high-risk borrowers.
It proves the exact opposite.
It does. The text notes that through Grameen Bank alone, over 10 million entrepreneurs were created, and 97% of them are women. This is not a charitable subsidy we're talking about. It is a highly functional, fiercely disciplined engine of capital allocation.
And it's not just about borrowing either. It actively fosters capital accumulation. The data mentions PKSF, which is an apex development organization that funds various microfinance institutions in Bangladesh. The curriculum notes that PKSF members accumulated nearly 5,000 crore taka in savings during FY 22-23 alone.
That is real, grassroots financial resilience. When the macroeconomic shocks hit, when the inflation spikes to 11%, or a flood destroys a crop, that savings buffer prevents these families from falling completely back into extreme poverty.
The curriculum links this microfinance success to a broader philosophical framework, highlighting the 3 zeros theory introduced by Dr. Muhammad Yunus.
Yes.
And this theory seems to provide the actual intellectual architecture for this whole parallel economy. Let's examine the mechanics of the 3 zeros. Zero poverty, zero unemployment, and zero net carbon emissions.
Right, and this isn't just aspirational rhetoric like something on a motivational poster. It is a fundamental critique of classical economic theory. Let's look at the first pillar, zero poverty. Dr. Yunus argues that poverty is an artificial construct. It is not an intrinsic flaw of the individual.
Right, the person isn't poor because they lack the capacity or the drive or the intelligence to create value.
Exactly. They are poor because the structural design of the traditional financial system actively denies them access to the primary tool of wealth creation, capital.
The 99% repayment rate of microfinance literally proves that the capacity is there. Once this system is redesigned to actually provide the tool, the poverty is eradicated through their own labor.
Which leads directly into the second pillar, zero unemployment. Now, this is perhaps the most radical shift in perspective.
Yeah, how can a country eliminate unemployment when macro growth is slowing down to 3.7%?
By entirely redefining what employment means. Traditional economics trains the population to view themselves as laborers waiting to be absorbed by an employer. If the factories aren't hiring, you are quote-unquote unemployed. The 3 zeros philosophy argues that human beings are inherently entrepreneurs, not just job seekers.
So unemployment is just a failure of the system to facilitate that natural entrepreneurship.
Exactly. If you provide widespread access to microcapital, you shift the population from waiting for wage labor to creating self-sustaining microenterprises. They become self-employed. The whole concept of waiting for a massive corporation to hire you becomes obsolete.
This relies really heavily on the concept of social entrepreneurship discussed in the text. This is a very specific operational model, distinct from traditional capitalism and distinct from traditional charity.
Yes. A traditional capitalist enterprise is legally and operationally designed to maximize financial returns for its shareholders above all else. A charity relies on continuous donor funding to provide free services. A social business sits right in the middle.
How so?
It is a non-loss, non-dividend company designed specifically to solve a social problem, like providing affordable healthcare, clean energy, or sanitation.
But it operates with the ruthless efficiency of a business. It generates revenue, covers its own costs, and becomes entirely self-sustaining.
Yes, the crucial difference is that the profits are reinvested entirely back into expanding the social mission, rather than being extracted by the founders as personal wealth.
It harnesses the mechanics of free markets to achieve the goals of social equity.
Exactly.
Which brings us to the third zero, zero net carbon emissions. The curriculum connects this directly to the rise of green banking in Bangladesh.
And this is vital.
Because for a developing nation still trying to industrialize, Focusing on carbon emissions might seem to some people like a luxury, but the text frames it as a hard economic necessity. Green banking isn't just a corporate social responsibility initiative. It is a core risk management strategy.
Precisely. Bangladesh is widely recognized as one of the most climate-vulnerable nations on Earth. For a bank operating there, climate change is a direct, quantifiable threat to the loan portfolio.
Right. If you lend massive amounts of capital to build a factory in a coastal zone that is statistically likely to be underwater in 20 years, that is a bad loan.
It's a terrible loan. So green banking involves integrating environmental risk assessments directly into the credit approval process.
It means actively denying credit to environmentally destructive projects like highly polluting brick kilns or unsustainable agriculture, and creating preferential, lower-interest credit lines for sustainable projects.
Like financing solar mini-grids in rural areas, or funding effluent treatment plants for the garment factories, or supporting climate-resilient agriculture.
It is the realization that economic stability is functionally impossible if the physical environment is collapsing around you.
Exactly.
So the curriculum presents us with this intense duality, a macroeconomy suffocating under toxic debt and capital flight, running perfectly parallel to a highly disciplined, innovative grassroots economy.
It's two different worlds in one country, and these two realities are about to be thrust onto the global stage in a completely unprecedented way. The final major theme of the data brings us to a massive, impending structural shift for Bangladesh.
The LDC graduation.
Yes.
Least developed country graduation. Now, the terminology is inherently positive. It implies success, right?
Yeah.
Moving up to the next tier,
Right.
graduating. But the data reveals it to be an incredibly perilous transition. Let's explain the mechanics of the UN's LDC classification.
The UN categorizes the world's most vulnerable economies as LDCs. This status is essentially a suite of global economic training wheels. It provides a nation with specialized international support measures, primarily in the form of preferential trade access and highly concessional, very low-interest foreign aid.
It's the global community acknowledging that a country's economic engine is just too fragile to compete in a completely open, ruthless global market.
But Bangladesh has historically performed exceptionally well against the graduation criteria. The UN looks at three main indices: gross national income per capita, the Human Asset Index, which measures health, nutrition, and education, and the Economic Vulnerability Index.
And the data shows Bangladesh is absolutely crushing the thresholds.
They are.
The requirement for GNI per capita is $1,230. Bangladesh is currently at $1,827. The required Human Asset Index score is 66. Bangladesh is sitting at 75.33. They have met the criteria to graduate. The training wheels are coming off.
Which brings tremendous reputational benefits. Graduating from LDC status is a powerful signal of macroeconomic maturity. It fundamentally alters the country's branding globally.
It signals to global rating agencies that the sovereign risk has decreased, which theoretically should improve credit ratings and attract larger pools of sophisticated foreign direct investment.
It's the official stamp that you are a middle-income developing nation.
But, and here's where it gets really interesting, the curriculum spends a massive amount of time analyzing the negative side of this ledger, the actual costs of graduation. Because when you lose the LDC status, you lose the safety net.
And the most critical loss is something known as DFQF access, duty-free, quota-free access.
Let's break down exactly how critical this mechanism is.
Currently, because of its LDC status, Bangladesh can export its goods to major markets, particularly the European Union, without paying standard import tariffs.
So a shipment of Bangladeshi garments arrives at a European port significantly cheaper than a similar shipment from a non-LDC competitor like, say, Vietnam or India.
Yes. That tariff exemption is the primary competitive advantage that built the Bangladeshi export miracle over the last few decades.
Entirely. But upon graduation, that exemption just vanishes. The curriculum warns that without DFQF access, the tariffs applied to Bangladeshi exports could suddenly jump by 8% to 12%.
Meaning overnight, the cost of a Bangladeshi garment on a retail shelf in Berlin or Paris becomes 10% more expensive, through absolutely no fault of the factory's operational efficiency.
And here is where the structural vulnerability of the entire economy is brutally exposed. The data points out that an overwhelming 85% of Bangladesh's total export revenue is derived from a single sector: ready-made garments.
85%.
Total lack of diversification. They are essentially a mono-export economy.
If you rely on one single product for 85% of your foreign revenue, and the price of that product suddenly increases by 10% on the global market due to new tariffs,
The foreign buyers have massive incentive to shift their supply chains.
they will simply source the garments from a country that still has LDC status or a country that has negotiated specialized bilateral free trade agreements.
And if the garment orders plummet, it triggers a catastrophic chain reaction. The factories close, millions of workers lose their jobs, and that disciplined grassroots economy we just discussed is suddenly starved of income.
The graduation represents the ultimate economic stress test. Bangladesh is transitioning from a concession-based economy where it competes based on cheap labor and international tariff waivers to a pure competition-based economy.
To survive post-graduation, they have to compete on productivity, infrastructure efficiency, technological sophistication, and the overall ease of doing business.
Which brings us full circle right back to the beginning of the data. They cannot compete on infrastructure efficiency if the state-owned banks are sitting on 14 Dhaka metros worth of bad debt.
Exactly.
They cannot attract the necessary technological investment if FDI is plummeting because foreign companies can't repatriate their dollars.
And they cannot build a highly skilled, highly productive workforce if 11% inflation is forcing families to actively cut back on their children's nutrition and education today.
The overlapping crises are the exact hurdles they must clear to survive the graduation. It is a monumental task of economic engineering.
We have dissected an immense amount of data today from the live written curriculum. We have traced the global plumbing of interest rates and inflation. We observed the heavy conditional leverage of the IMFs, analyzed the retreat of foreign capital, and stared into the abyss of a banking sector compromised by cronyism and evergreening.
But we also found a profound resilience in the architecture of microfinance and social entrepreneurship,
The incredible duality of the Bangladeshi economic model.
and understanding the friction between these two realities, the failing macrostructure and the hyper-efficient microstructure, is the entire point of this exercise.
These acronyms, the NPLs, the SDRs, the FDI flows, they aren't just vocabulary words. They dictate the physical reality of a nation. They determine whether a factory opens or closes, whether a currency holds its value, and whether a country can stand independently on the global stage.
When you understand the mechanics beneath the statistics, you inoculate yourself against simplistic narratives. You see the machinery of the global economy for what it actually is.
I want to leave you with one final thought to process on your own. We began by noting how the macroeconomic diagnostic machine is often broken, providing a murky X-ray of the patient. Consider this contradiction. A nation can theoretically achieve graduation on paper, perfectly meeting international UN thresholds for per capita income and human assets.
Right.
Yet simultaneously, its domestic banking architecture can be rotting from within, and relentless inflation can be systematically degrading the daily caloric intake of its working class.
It really exposes the limits of our metrics.
It does. It forces us to ask, do our traditional macroeconomic indicators, the GDPs and the GNIs, actually capture the reality of human existence? Are we measuring the right variables, or does the 21st century economy require an entirely new diagnostic dashboard to separate the illusion of growth from the reality of prosperity? Something to think about. Keep questioning the numbers, keep demanding to know the mechanics behind the data, and stay relentlessly curious. We will see you next time.